Hi everyone. Hopefully you can hear me and see me all right. Good stuff. Sounds like it at least. Welcome to rainy Thursday here in London at least. So for those that are new to these sessions, my name's Ben from Rare Consulting. We're a research and product development business, and we've been tracking how consumers have been responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, what the impact's been on different categories. So I'm going to be taking you through some of our latest research. We do these every week. So we update everybody who comes each week on some of the latest things that we're finding. There's plenty of stuff to get through. And in this, I'm quite excited about this week actually, because we were asked to pull together some data for a couple of conferences at the end of the month. And I've decided to pull some of that data partway through field work, so I can share with you guys to just give you some really interesting insights for this session as well. So we've got more data to work with this time around, and what we're going to cover is I'll give, for those that are new to these sessions, I'll just give you a bit of an overview in terms of what we're doing, and an update on some of the more macro trends that we've been identifying over the past few weeks and months. Yeah, months, right? Been here a long time. And then with the new data we gathered this week, I'll take you through some questions as to how this might affect what a lot of people in the industry call customer journeys, and how it's going to affect decision making and things like that. We're quite excited about sharing that. And then I'll cover off a little bit about brand reputation scores, and then we'll go into the different sectors as per usual, but I will apply some of the changes in journeys that we might foresee against different sectors for you guys. In terms of what we're doing, so we've interviewed nearly 12,000 people in the last 2 months. So we've interviewed quite a lot on our tracker surveys, and then we have our weekly brand perception studies, where we're just identifying how well they're responding to the pandemic, and from the point of view of consumers, and then what's their level of trust and likability. So it's quite simple metrics, but there are perfect correlations almost in every instance of how they've responded and how they're perceived. And then we've also got our diary studies alongside that, which you can download from our site. Thanks for putting in your requests about what you'd like to cover. So I'm really mindful at trying to be able to cover off as much of this as possible. And what you'll see, it's a bit like Jeremy Corbyn at PMQs. I won't say the names, of course, but I will be calling out against some of the questions you've asked in previous webinars and you've asked on the website. So I'm going to try to address those more directly. What you see is there's just a huge variety in terms of what people are looking at, a big degree of variation across different categories, but everything is related. That's the really important thing, I think, to get across. But I'll do my best to address most of the questions, or all of the questions if I can, that you can see on that slide. But as with anything, if you ever want to ask questions, you can just give me a shout, and my contact details will be at the end of the presentation. But cool. So in terms of context for this week, it's quite an interesting one. When we're looking across a lot of the data set, we are seeing some consistencies, but then some new kind of patterns that are emerging and solidifying in some respects. In terms of some of the more macro factors that are going to really play out over the coming months, the big thing this week's really been about schools and how the plan of reopening hasn't quite worked according to plan. And we've got which of course will mean makes it harder for people who are managing jobs and careers and juggling those two things, because obviously for some people, schools are proxy for childcare in a lot of cases. You can all the calls I have with people, you can just hear sort of banging around in the background with teenagers getting a bit kind of grumpy at the situation. So I think that's going to have a really big impact operationally speaking. And it's also going to have a big impact in terms of how we move around cities and engage with spaces, which will inevitably have an impact on how people are decided to buy products and services. So it all has a relationship. Non-essential retail will start to open from next week. So record stores and various other places will open from Monday. However, in terms of that rollout, lots of businesses are are taking a very different view. Those that are more risk averse are less inclined to open their stores so quickly. And we've all, and I've talked about this a number of times, we all have to consider what's the experience going to be like when you get there. I think the supermarket's been a really good sort of test bed in terms of what sort of works, what's sort of frustrating. And if you work in retail, which I know a lot of you do, I think there's some really important lessons to learn there about how you can improve the experience. I think there's also some elements politically which will have a big impact, and we've seen this in terms of how people are feeling. And I'm getting the sense, looking at not only our data but other data sources as well, that there's an element to which the response of the pandemic, the political side of it, will have an impact, I think, in terms of the perceived culture war, if I can hopefully use that type of language, but very much how that was used politically last year. There's lots of things out there at the moment that are happening in the UK which are difficult for lots of people, and we're seeing very polarised opinions about how we address it. What we'll see with the change in leadership in the Labour Party and how they're trying to make a name for themselves will inevitably have an impact in terms of people's perceptions of how the government's doing. And in terms of businesses, it's really interesting to see that it's estimated about 100,000 businesses, it's believed at the moment, will fold. It could be a lot more, but I was surprised at seeing, it's quite a low number, but lots of businesses that exist are able to kind of operate, without much cash coming in for a few months. I think I saw some research by it's an organisation that Prince Charles runs. I forget what it was now, but it was saying that it's normally around 3 months cash is what most companies have to work with in the bank. So it kind of goes to show that there has been some degree of resilience to the situation up to date, but of course we're going to have to see what happens in the future. And a lot of that is still really uncertain. So as you know, for those who've been on, I quite like putting a poll in. I wanted to know, I've asked this question 2 months ago on a webinar with 100 people on it, and I wanted to know how certain or uncertain they felt about future outcomes. And I'm going to ask you guys the same. Hopefully you should be able to see this. And the idea is then I just want to get a bit of a litmus test really to see how things are, how things might have changed over time, whether people feel more certain, less certain. It's a pretty crude question, I'll admit. It's not the best design question because you are quite limited with GoToWebinar, but hopefully you'll be able to do it. If you have any issues with the software, if you don't see the radio buttons appearing, if you minimize your screen, you should be able to see that. Cool, that's most of you voted. So if I share those results, 4% said you feel certain about future outcomes, 32% said you feel neither certain or uncertain, and 64% said you feel uncertain about future outcomes. And that's really interesting. So last time I ran this, 10% said they felt certain. So obviously it's a different data set, different set of people, but the pattern overall is reasonably similar. You got 10% who previously said certain, 37% said they're in the middle, and 53% said they're uncertain about future outcomes. Interesting. Yeah, it's going to be. I think it's really, these kind of metrics are really interesting to see how companies are likely to respond. I love sort of talking about uncertainty. I think this is a really interesting principle because in reality things are always really uncertain. You might feel that you just might respond to it differently based on the context that you're in. But that's a conversation for another day, I think, to be honest. You should be back to the slides now, I hope, unless anyone screams at me otherwise. So yeah, thanks for that. I think it's interesting to compare the differences, and of course, data like the sort of data we're putting out in public, and being able to see some degree of consistency in the patterns will help, I think, alleviate some of that uncertainty and help businesses make decisions, which is ultimately, what we're here to do. In terms of the research, I want to just give you a bit of an update in terms of what people are looking forward to the most. We've tracked this over the last 5 weeks, so some of you have been before will be familiar with this. It's quite interesting to see the dynamicism now, because although we are seeing people really want to spend time with family, they're really really looking forward to having experiences and to meeting other people. The sort of stories actually off screen now is we've seen about 4 weeks ago, the proportion of people who said they were looking forward to shopping the most was 1%. It's now currently at 4%, so it's just after work. It's kind of missed the top 10, as it were. So there's certainly an element, I think, where people can now visualize the ability to go into the high street and to spend money. So I think that's a positive for the retail market. For holiday and travel, it's been consistently at 8% now for the last 3 weeks. It's previously been at 4%. We've seen in this week's data, there's still a high degree of evidence that people are planning their holidays, whether that be in the UK or internationally. But certainly, it still comes back to the fact that people just want to spend time with their friends, spend time with each other and their family. It's very much driven experientially. And how does that play out with our sense of community? It's sort of flattened to some extent, I'd say, in the last couple of weeks. So there is a bit of an uptick there in terms of people feeling a sense of community with their friends, and I think that kind of coincides with what we're seeing with the lockdown restrictions have been lifted. People, the idea of seeing your friends is no longer just you're going to chat to them over Skype. Skype never uses that anymore, do they? How 2002 of me, over Zoom or various other ways of doing it. I've noticed in my own habits in March, April, I was chatting to my mates all the time over video conferencing, and it's kind of less now, I think, because people know that they're able to meet up again. So there is an indication that in the last week, with the relaxation of the lockdown rules, that our sense of community with our friends will start to increase. We'll see how that plays out in the coming weeks. And that's, I think, really important, because a lot of advertising that's been done to date has been considered in some respects to be a little bit kind of patronizing to this idea of, we'll see each other again, and people feeling a little bit condescended where they're completely bunkered at home with no ability to go anywhere. Well, the reality of the situation is that actually it's becoming perhaps in the short term something that is more realistic. And so that has a big implication, I think, in the way that we communicate in our messaging, in advertising and comms and that sort of thing. So this sort of data, I think, is really important in terms of reading the room and getting a sense of the tone, as is how people are feeling, which has remained relatively constant with the last week. So we saw a sharp decrease following the rule-busting Dominic Cummings piling up the M1 up to Durham. Would you go the M1? I don't know. Don't drive anymore. We did see a sharp 5% decrease in the number of people who feel worried in the UK. That's that green line at the top. And that was replaced by feelings of restlessness and content. So you've got this kind of weird situation where we've got really different responses to the pandemic, which I've covered before. A question that someone asked on the last webinar was, what is the profile of those different emotions? How are people feeling? And if you looked at how the group of people who feel worried, restless, content, or happy, there's some quite interesting patterns. Broadly speaking, of course, this is only looking at it demographically, which is relatively limited in terms of profiling people. But what we're seeing is that Gen Zs are likely to be more happy, millennials are likely to be the most restless, Gen X are more likely to be content compared to millennials. And I think the implication here again is all around your communication strategy. So if you want to take a temperature check and read the room, well, what we're seeing is that actually there's a different response according to age profile. That's only looking at sort of age and different conurbations where they live and that sort of thing. But if you've got other data sets that allow you to understand their sort of typical personality traits or their kind of more sociographic and psychographic data, then you can obviously do things that are a lot more rigorous with that. But certainly to paint a picture, as I've said a number of times, is certainly not uniform. I think this backs up the case. And it might be that one useful thing to do with your own CRM data and your own customer base is to be able to profile people along these kind of axes when you're communicating. As I've said before, it's quite an emotional thing that we're all going through. So people will respond in different ways, and you need to be able to read the room differently. And I mentioned earlier on about this idea of this the situation, not only with COVID-19 pandemic, but the Black Lives Matter movement, in some respects does reveal, and I'm careful how I put this, does reveal to some extent the kind of the culture wars that do exist. It's been interesting to see the events in Bristol over the weekend and how different parts of the media have responded to that. Going inside, there's some data from King's College London, which looked at what type of typographies might we see in terms of how people are responding to the pandemic. And there's some really interesting political dimensions to it. So you've got the trusting group, and they're predominantly people who might have voted Leave before, predominantly more conservative with a small c, and they're more likely to trust what the government's saying and to follow that advice. Then you've got the group, which is quite funny, it's called the dissenting group, which is the sort of the more Remain camp, who've been more critical of what the government's done. And then you've got the frustrated set who's somewhere in the middle. And why this is important, because it's sort of, I think we'll see how, obviously we're going to see how this plays out in the coming weeks. But it could be that the situation we're going through and where we pledge our allegiances in terms of the information we get. Some people might prefer to refer to evidence from science or the World Health Organization as opposed to the government when making a decision. Some people will trust the government implicitly. But these things have a huge impact in terms of their behavior and what they're likely to do, where they're likely to go and how they're likely to respond. So for any of you in a kind of commercial setting, these things, although we generally tend to just kind of leave it over here and try to forget about it and kind of don't want to get involved, it's going to have an impact. It's going to have quite a considerable impact, in the immediate term. Longer term, I think, it'd be interesting to see how it all plays out. But plenty. There's a couple of really interesting universities looking at this. King's College London, UCL as well, doing quite good work on this. So it's worth having a little look. So in terms of trends, there's some consistency with terms of how people feel, but the way people feel is really quite diverse, and that's a complicated thing to come over. When communicating, I think we need to be mindful of those differences, and we need to be able to, I think in some respects, embrace it and communicate differently. Despite what we've been advised by governments, etc., how people are behaving, we're seeing is kind of breaking a little bit at the edges. So we all need to be mindful of that. But all these things have a huge impact on how it affects journeys. Now, this is, as I mentioned up top, we've been preparing data collection for a couple of conferences we've been invited to at the end of the month, and I thought I'll give you guys the first look at it rather than a bunch of strangers, since a lot of you come week in, week out. So what we've done is we've pulled the data just before the end of the fieldwork. So I would call this interim data, not final data, because we're still in field with it. But I wanted to share this with you because I think it's really important. I've not seen much spoken about over the last few months about how it's going to affect customer journeys. Lots of people are talking about the impact on sort of sales and sort of big, kind of very easy to identify metrics like, is it going to affect my sales? Are people going to be coming to the website more or not? But actually, there's a lot more nuance to this, because if mentioned up top, if no one's going to be going to schools for 6 months, well, there's less reason to leave the house. There's less reason to leave the house. There's less reason to casually pop into a shop and go purchase goods. So it's going to impact how our worldview is and where we're kind of focusing our time and effort. So what we did a piece of analysis where we looked at what people previously preferred to do. So what was their preferred means to find out information? So in that kind of early part of a journey versus what's their preferred means when they come to purchase. And then we asked them, what's their intention in the future? And how do they perceive themselves to be responding later on? The sort of data that we found, that the kind of metrics, is pretty consistent with what I've seen across different clients, different projects that we've done over the years, and with other institutions, like a lot of the work that Google does on the Think with Google website. If you've not been, it's really good for doing kind of journey analysis. What we're seeing, though, is interesting that before, when it comes to things like electronics or building garden supplies and things like that, people would be generally geared to looking online to get their information. Then they might go in store to buy it, or they might continue online, but it's very much using digital means to make a decision in a journey. And all these different categories, whether it be clothes or food or white goods, they've all got a very different journey pattern. So in white goods, generally tends to be more of a research journey. You spend more time finding out about it, evaluating your choice before you purchase. Depending, it obviously depends on the level of engagement in that category. Whereas with food, we generally tend to be more habitual with the way we make decisions, and that's how a lot of stores are laid out to take advantage of that. But what we're seeing with some of these categories, so in sports or in gifting, in hobbies and interests, white goods, furniture products, so there's a high degree of which people will seek out information online. Now, if you ask them, well, how do you think you're gonna, what's your kind of preference when things are eased up and we're allowed outside? What would be your, what's your preference in terms of what you do? And we're seeing some interesting swings in the data. So you can see there that previously, when it came to clothing, you had a proportion of people who'd go in store. Well, that's now dropped by 4%. And increased online by 4%. So there's potentially, there's a potential swing there of up to 8% movement in clothes, 11% in food, which we've seen. Ocado have announced a massive investment drive in the coming months to be able to, get themselves ready for what for the future. People being forced to buy food online has had a huge impact on their intention to buy goods in other categories, as has being stuck at home and not being able to go anywhere. So it's all really important stuff to kind of get your head around to see where the patterns might move. And the movements we're seeing are predominantly with store and online. So that's in terms of where people gather information. So it's not about where they purchase, it's about where they gather information to inform whether they're going to purchase or not. When you look at how when it comes to buying patterns, again, you're seeing for something like electronics, the majority of people would prefer to buy online. If it's related to hobbies and interests, again, get a bit more time to research and find the thing that works for you. I mean, it's certainly the case in music, where I've spent quite a lot of my time personally over many years. It's kind of where you go to now. You could go to Gap down in Brighton or Anderson's over in Guildford, but you do it online now. You don't really sort of go in store. It's probably because you've got some kind of guitar playing virtuoso just embarrassing you when you walk in there. But certain categories have been faster to move online compared to others, as we can see. But now if you look at the swing in terms of where that's going to move, it's potentially huge. As I mentioned, we're partway through the data collection, so this is based off 500 people. We're going to be doing it up to 1,000 by the end of the week, so I will have an update on this. But I wanted to give you an early read to show that there's potentially in some cases massive swings of up to 25% when it comes to things like sport. So why is this important? Well, it's going to be super important for companies that haven't been through a transformation digitally, who are kind of gone, well, it doesn't matter, whatever, we're buying, it's not how people behave. Well, the truth is, where in terms of people's intention is very much moving in that direction, and I'd say increasingly more the case now more than ever. So yeah, I wanted to share that with you because I think this came up there were two questions related to this after the last webinar from a couple of online retailers who might be on the call. So yeah, I thought I'd investigate this in a bit more detail and present it this week for you to have a little look at. I'm going to show later on in the different categories where those movements are in a bit more detail. So where are people swinging from and to? Careful how you say that sentence. So what about the reputational impacts? So for those that are new to these sessions, we track how the changes in consumer behaviour, but we also track the change in perception. One of the things we've been really quite conscious of is when it all came about and we're all told to stay at home, lots of companies were very quick to respond, some were a little bit slower. And our experiences of engaging with supermarkets and different brands over this period has given rise to some that are performing, or I'd say maintaining a position, and then we've got some actually who are not going to come out perceptionally, not going to come out too strong out the back of it. Apologies for how kind of difficult it is to sort of look at this slide. I think it's quite beautiful looking at all that, or the string of data there. I just wanted to show you some updates in retail. So for Argos, who are increasingly becoming one of the stronger performers in the retail sector, you can see they've maintained a position pretty much from from late April through to now, remaining relatively steady, with 50% of people saying they believe they've given a good response. Whereas Burton and a lot of the Arcadia brands have struggled with PR and comms, and in particular, when you look at a lot of local news, there's a lot of headlines about them pulling out of certain areas, and of course there is a kind of corporate comms angle to this as well, about how they've responded at an ownership level. Lots of calls, I think, for some of the support the government are offering to be means tested for different organisations. I was listening to a podcast this week about the theatre sector, which was invested in heavily after World War II to try and get people out and to engage and to create space and moments for people. But lots of theatres, this was a Guardian one I listened to on Monday. It's a theatre up in Scotland who, they're really, really struggling because they're not exactly in the sort of the priority list in terms of getting support from the government. Furlough, I think, is the only sort of route they've been able to do, but lots of companies have benefited from CBILS loans and bounce back loans, which haven't been made available to everybody. So, sort of, the reputation side of it is super important, as this is a highly emotional time for lots of us, and it's the sort of thing that people don't necessarily forget. And when you look at the levels of trust for Argos compared to Burton, as an example, Argos have remained, somewhere between 60 to 70% over the last few weeks. It fluctuates, but it does fluctuate in some respect with the feeling within the nation of how people feel. Companies like Burton more recently have announced, more store closures. There's a lot of uncertainty around jobs in local areas for a lot of Arcadia brands, and have struggled as a result in more recent weeks. And the relationship between their response and trust levels between those two companies, we see Argos is a strong correlation at 0.7, and it's a almost perfect correlation at 0.91 for Burton. So we can see the worse they are responding, the lower the levels of trust that are given to that particular brand. Facebook's an interesting one. You can fling loads of mud at them, or at least I should say they fling loads of mud at themselves, I guess, is probably the truth of the matter. But they've still managed to maintain a relatively Teflon perception certainly in more recent weeks. Recently there's quite a lot of around the politics of things, and how there's particularly what's going on in the States, what's going on here. They've claimed in the past to take into consideration the role of politicians and their expenditure on Facebook, but so far we haven't actually seen words turn into actions in that respect. And of course, they had a lot of employees. At least I saw this on Twitter. I don't know whether people in the non-Twitter sphere can see it, but at the middle of May, lots of people saying, "Well, we're not going to be, we're going to strike." But it's, as a business, they're really, they are good at responding to lots of these things, and they've announced Facebook Shops was announced, late May, just before some of the protests really kicked off, and more recently, their movement into conferencing products in the Messenger app has helped improve their market value. So no matter what's kind of thrown at them, they seem to be able to somehow manage their way through it. And I guess that's not just in terms of their comms, but it's also as a product where so many people get their news and information. It's where they spend such a large proportion of their time. There's probably lessons in that, I think, for lots of businesses as well, how they manage to kind of get away with it, if I can say that so bluntly. But yeah, we've seen certainly in the data, there is a strong relationship between how you respond and the trust, which is important for creating a long-term loyal relationship. So I thought I'd move into the different sectors and show how they're performing, and give you a brief overview on each of the ones that we're covering. In grocery, we're seeing relatively consistent metrics over the past few weeks. There is certainly a movement in local communities for people to support local services. So 32% of people visited their local convenience store last week, and 14% said they visited the butcher, which is quite, still quite high. 45% of household decision makers went into the supermarket main store. So what we're seeing is a little bit where people are going to other places to top up the basket. a lot of trade is still happening online. So we've seen it fluctuate around 40 to 50% in the last couple of weeks. It does move. What we're observing is that people generally will tend to buy a sort of a main, so they're still sort of doing a bulk purchase online and then doing top-ups more locally is the kind of pattern that we're seeing. And how that's going to change. So looking at how things have switched, if you consider prior to the lockdown, people's preferred choice would have been 74% of people said, generally prefer to do it in store, 80% saying online, and 8% saying other. Other is made up of through a member of the family or over the phone or other kind of means. It's quite a kind of top-line crude analysis, but really it's about the direction of travel that we're interested in. So if you think about that 74%, how they were behaving prior to lockdown to where they see themselves in the future, you got 47%. So that's of the 74, you got 47%. So that's around, doing the maths in my head, that's around 2/3 saying they would continue within store. But you've got a really big swing there. 25% saying, in future I'm intending to do this online, which just goes to show that Ocado's announcement that they're going to be investing, I think it's 1 billion. I did say that earlier, didn't I? Is potentially justified given what might happen. For those that would typically buy online, it's around one in five. That's their preferred route. 6% saying, actually in the future they prefer to be able to do it in store. Plenty of reasons for that. We talk a lot in the industry about, people, everything going online. Well, at the same time, yes, but, we can't eliminate the fact that as humans, we like to solve problems, and sometimes the weekly shop is a little bit of problem solving, a little bit of way of not thinking about, all the stuff you've got to do the next day. So there is a small degree to which people are moving that way, but 11% of the 18 of the total will remain online. So we're just seeing 7% of people moving into their preference moving to other means. And for the other group, it's quite interesting. You've got sort of half of them saying they're going to stay in other, and then you've got around sort of 40%, so 3% of them moving in store. So it's quite interesting to see the patterns of where that intention moves. I'm going to cover retail and exercise as we move through to the other categories. In travel, I would normally been covering quite a lot in travel in the last few weeks because there's just so much going on in it. This week there's a little bit less to cover because I'm also focusing on some of the journey analysis that people requested. We're seeing that there's a consistency in terms of people's desire to travel in the UK. So we've seen it fluctuate around 40, 47%, 43%. It's currently at 45% of people saying they intend only to stay in the UK for their future holidays. 13% of the UK are evaluating the cost of holiday, so it's very much in people's mindset. They're thinking about it, and what we are seeing is those, again, attitudinally, who are not as concerned about coronavirus are more likely to be browsing for holiday destinations compared to those that aren't. So again, we've got to think beyond demographics. We need to be thinking more about attitudinal data and other types of behavioural data when we're trying to understand what might happen in the future. But as you can see, about a quarter of people saying they browse for holiday destinations in the last week, and it's a similar sort of proportion, 21%. So call that 1 in 5 browsing for flights, hotels, and accommodations. I noticed that Ryanair have been really quite public, saying that lots of people are flooding back and booking flights. So it'd be interesting to know whether that's been something that that's been seen by other airlines. I was talking to a contact of mine who works over in Switzerland and works for an organisation that represents the European travel industry, and he was saying that there's been a big spike in other markets at the moment. In terms of travel, I came across this, which is just, the pictures kind of cracked me up, so I just kind of wanted to share it really. You might remember a couple of weeks ago, those of you who were here, when we discussed how different organisations and restaurants and hotels are coping with this idea of how do you get people back into a space to create a compelling experience in a restaurant setting. I came across this. This is called Plexeat. I don't know if I'm saying that right. It's it's designed by a French designer. I'm not going to try and pronounce his name. his name's Christoph, can't do his surname though, and he's come up with this this kind of concept for creating, well, I suppose it's sort of PPE. It's like an extreme version of PPE, isn't it? At the table, that was quite interesting to see. You know, it's another way of creating more of an aesthetically pleasing space when we know we're going to have these restrictions in the short term. We could well have these restrictions in the long term. And while so much, you know, we talked earlier about uncertainty, I think it's important to look at how people are addressing problem solving their way through these things. So I thought I'd share this because it was yeah, quite an interesting way compared to the one I shared a couple of weeks where different restaurants are putting mannequins in different seats, or people have been playing background noise and chatter. I think they've done that in the Bundesliga with football, haven't they, to try and give the sense that there's a crowd watching a game. So yeah, there's been some really imaginative ways of solving a real important part of the experience. In entertainment, we're seeing a consistent set of behaviours compared to last week. Post the bank holiday, we saw a bit of a change in the weather, people bunkering down a little bit more at home, although they are spending time still in the garden doing DIY and things like that. 61% of the UK listen to music every day. That's every day, twice or three times a week. So that's people are doing it every 3 days or more at home. That's consistent with what we've seen in previous weeks as well. And the new skills revolution is still very much still part and parcel of things. Around 1 in 5 people say they are exercising new skills each week. I thought it would be interesting to look at and compare. I've spoken in previous weeks about the sort of balance of old content versus new, and this has become relevant to me personally because my partner's an actress and she's had to go to Spain to carry on filming. And I might have mentioned this in previous webinars, I can't remember, but essentially what was meant to be a 2-week shoot for her on an episode has turned into 7 weeks just because of the way they're having to manage the shoot. And so we're going to have this issue, I think, with a lot of content providers about how do you create content, not now, but in the future, because you're going to have this period where lots of productions are slowing down. In the case of my partner, she's having to stay, you know, considerable longer length of time to get the shoot done. And what was aimed to be out by the early 2021, difficult to say, 2021, looks like that's going to be moved back by the studio in order to get it, you know, to still be able to do the editing and everything else in process. So everyone's just eating content like there's no tomorrow, of course. But there's quite a bit of a difference in terms of those that are, you know, want to see content they're familiar with and those that are seeking out content that they've not seen before. And you can see generally sort of younger people or people who live in more kind of larger cities, you know, kind of cities like London or Birmingham, Leeds, Manchester, are more likely to be, you know, to be seeking out content they've not seen or heard before. Again, when it comes to targeting, then, you know, these are the kind of cohorts that are kind of more hungry for this type of content. And as well as what we're seeing, I think in the entertainment world, from what I've seen with sort of more through the sort of personal anecdotes, will have a role to play, I think, for lots of brands as well. It's becoming ultimately an attention war with people spending more time online. So how do you create ways of making that more engaging? In terms of habits, I've talked about this a couple of times before. So we are seeing that in terms of those new behaviours, around 1 in 5 are, you know, engaging in new hobbies they weren't doing before. We're going to turn this into a focus in the coming weeks. We, as part of a project we've been doing again for public release, we're asking people what they've been doing, but we're also going to be asking them what they think or how inclined, we're going to be measuring how inclined they are to continue these things into the future. So what new hobbies and habits can we perceive as we move through? But certainly at the moment, people are spending quite a bit of time on more sort of individualistic practices and rituals that kind of improve themselves or allow a creative streak to come out through the arts and craft, or things that maybe can be equally as creative, like, you know, cooking, baking, gardening, things like that, still solving problems during the process. But generally, the pattern we're seeing is things generally tend to be more individualistic. Of course, we're now going to be entering a phase that we saw earlier where people are feeling a sense of community with their friends has increased slightly as we're coming out of lockdown. Are the more individualistic habits that we'd formed throughout the lockdown, are we going to see those continue into the future? And what's the impact? What does that mean for the time that people have available to engage, spend, whatever with your organisation? These are all questions I think that everybody needs to be asking, because, as I mentioned before, everything's quite interrelated. I thought this is something I just thought was really wonderful. I'm quite into films and things like this, and came across this from Germany. It's an organisation called Windowflix. It's more of a charitable, community-focused initiative where they are enabling local cinemas to appear in suburban areas. They help people with getting projectors and sound systems so they can invite a number of people to watching a film all together, which, cinema is potentially, theatres are, and music venues and all these places, it was a huge concern of how they're going to survive, because it's very difficult to enforce a 2-meter limit. And of course, they're just not going to survive. They're reliant on getting people through the door, getting people, buying drinks and engaging, interacting, etc. It's going to be really challenging. So I thought this is really interesting for those who are in that sector. It's just a way of potentially reimagining things at a community level, like creating that community spirit around watching films together. It's something that Secret Cinema have done really well over the last few years with their events down in London. But I thought this is a really nice one. Again, it just goes to show that culture and art will always find a way to adapt. Will always find a way to be part, heart and soul of our return back to things as they might have been before. So, yeah, an interesting one to cover. In terms of DIY and home, we've seen a temporary lull in activity, partly due to changing weather and the fact that I think last week we saw a boost with the bank holiday. So lots of people have more time to spend doing a bit of DIY, and they don't have to necessarily be on Zoom calls, etc. Those who are feeling restless have probably got the pent-up nervous energy and spend a lot more time in more domestic chores we're seeing at home at the moment. And that's important, because that's one way of how they actually are able to get their emotions out and to feel a little bit more relaxed. It's something that I find myself doing, cleaning up my pets quite regularly, probably just to kind of relieve myself from having to sort of manage home and work all from the same space. So we've seen a temporary lull in kind of the activity, but it's still really quite high. It's been one of the highest performing sectors we've seen. In terms of, again, looking at where people prefer to purchase, where they like to go, see, this is quite different compared to food. What we're seeing is that when it comes to DIY, which generally tends to be more of a research journey, we spend more time thinking about what we're doing, what we need to do, what's the problem we need to solve, because typically people have sort of less experience solving DIY problems than they would, eating food every day. You eat food every day, you don't necessarily do DIY every day, unless you're, 20% of men a couple of weeks ago who were doing it quite regularly throughout the week. So you've got, of the 68% of people who say they prefer or 68% of household decision makers prefer to buy in store, 53% of them in future will continue with that in-store purchase. So there's a level to which the majority of people will still prefer to go there to get goods and to purchase and make decisions. But there is a swing. 12% of people said actually they'll go online. For those who before the lockdown were buying things online, you've got a considerable proportion of them will still remain in that category. So it shifts from 23% to 17% in the online space, but you're losing 6% to in-store or the other category. And with the other category, you've seen the majority of them actually remaining there. Different cohorts are moving to different ways, to different means of purchase. So we are seeing, the question was, if what we're seeing in food, what impact does that have on other categories? Well, I think there's some evidence that it's impacting other categories as well, as people are getting used to spending more online. In general, they feel a bit more confident making decisions when they're removed from the product that they can see. And there's loads of really great innovations that are out there that enable people to bring that reality a little bit more further up in the decision-making process. When it comes to retail, we've seen that around that growth earlier on, around 4% of people saying they are looking forward to spending in they're looking forward to be able to go shopping once the lockdown eases, and that's moved from 1% from 3 weeks ago. So we've seen quite a bit of growth in that respect. Again, as previous weeks, we're seeing the biggest opportunities really with younger cohorts at the moment. But again, looking at how where that movement might happen in the future, if you break that down for those who were typically engaged in the category and decision makers in the category, 68% of them would prefer to buy in store, 29% would prefer to buy online, 6% would prefer other. So it's different, whether that be through a friend or over the phone or other means. Of those who wanted to buy in store, what we're seeing is that has seen quite a big movement. So it's gone from the majority actually to less than half in the data we're collecting at the moment. Of course, we will have an update on this next week with a larger data set to say with a high degree of certainty. But we're seeing that although the majority of them do stay consistent with the in-store experience, it moves from 64 to 46. You've got 15% of the total decision makers moving to online. So that's the direction of travel. That's where a lot of them are going. We work with a retailer who I know one of our retailers, I should say. I know that 85% of their revenue is usually in store, and 50% is online. So it's interesting to see if you sort of extrapolate that in their terms. That's going to be quite a big shift to online. So they're going to have to, ensure that the online experience is up to speed. Hence why we've been doing quite a lot of user experience tests with them over this period. With online, so typically 29% of people would prefer to buy online. And where do they move post pandemic into the future? Well, you've still got, for those who would normally would prefer to do it online, it's interesting to see there's sort of a variety in response. There's 15% of that 29. Of the overall household, of the overall decision makers in this category would stay in there. So you've got just over half staying, but then there's quite a significant number of people said actually that prefer to go in store. And that's with retail you do get those kind of frustrations in a lot of cases where people say I couldn't really find what I wanted. I want to be able to try things on and get that experience. But lots of new businesses are out there trying to solve that problem. In terms of other, it splits around half of people who are going to use other means are going to continue using those means. But of the 6%, you've got a sizable proportion who claim they'll move in store. So it's not a consistent sort of picture in retail. But looking at this overall at the moment, it would seem that the direction of travel is predominantly to online. I think some of the movements from online back to in-store could be due to experience problems, but we'll cover this in more detail in coming weeks with the larger data set. Obviously, this is for interim purposes only. The beauty there's a sense that things are opening up. Younger generations generally present more of an opportunity compared to others. And we've seen 21% of women did their own beauty treatments last week. And there's evidence to say actually people on furlough are currently quite engaged in the category as well. If you look at typical kind of weekly patterns that we've seen, in terms of people doing their own treatments has moved from 9% down to 7%. So there's a suggestion of a downward trend slightly. But as we are seeing that people are going to be socializing again in the future, I think this market will start to see more of a shift. So I haven't focused on that in too much detail this week for that reason. For exercise, this is one where we're seeing a bit of a shift in terms of how people engage with it. So around 1 in 4 of us are doing exercise each week. Cycling's become really quite popular in the last couple of weeks as well. Weather does have an impact on people's ability to get out, but certainly there's lots of stories of cycle shops being able to, struggling to keep up with that customer demand. In terms of the switching side of things, we're seeing that 18% of those that previously preferred to purchase in store are now considering going online. So using the same sort of pattern as earlier, in terms of decision makers, 53% would prefer to buy in store. And what we're seeing now is that of those decision makers, 32% would continue to purchase in store. You've got this huge swing of 18% moving to online. And this has been a category where there's been lots of engagement online, lots of independent yoga studios and sports brands bringing content to people to do exercise at home. And it's potentially that's potentially had an impact on people's willingness to engage in this sector. In terms of online, 33% of people prior to lockdown said that was their preferred choice in order to buy these types of products. And where are they moving? Well, there's not a huge amount of movement here when you look at it. There's the majority of them are still remaining online, but there is a movement to in-store and to use other means. And for other means, which is actually a lot higher than other categories, around 13%. I don't have a clue about buying exercise stuff. I always leave that to my partner, who's way more knowledgeable than I am. So I do kind of outsource my decision making. Around half of people would remain there, but it's interesting to see that that you've got of 5% of decision makers in this category would consider moving from using other means now to in-store in order to make those decisions. So great degree of fluctuation across different categories when we've looked at it. We've got data for all sorts of different categories, but I was really mindful of trying to cover all of this in the session today. We will include it in our report next week anyway, so you'll be able to sort of dive into the detail in our weekly tracker report in more depth. With alcohol, the main story here is that it's still daily consumption is still quite high, so around 1 in 5, 20% of us are drinking more than 3 times a week, so it's still quite highly engaged. And the number of particularly when you look at the difference in patterns in terms of gender, men are more likely to be drinking than women, and they're also likely to be drinking more. We've had a couple of organisations get in touch with us over this data in the past couple of weeks who are looking at this more in terms of kind of safety concerns with health organisations and things like that. So as a category, it doesn't move as much as we've seen with other sectors. But when you ask people about new habit formation they've had over the lockdown, I've been quite surprised at how many people are saying, you know what, I've kind of just given up drinking. It's better for my mental health that way. And you get the converse. You get other people saying, I'm using it to cope. That's really important because it's all about actually, as a society, how we communicate and how we cope with kind of stressful situations. And it's not only is it potentially going to be a bit of a strain on some resources into the future, but there's potentially some problematic habit formation. But yet at the same time, there are those who decide to not and have sort of seen some benefits as a result. One thing I'm quite curious at looking at actually is looking at the relationship between consumption and emotion over the coming weeks. It's something that we're going to be looking at as a kind of a retrospective look at the data. So if you're interested in that, then please give us a shout. Apologies, I feel like I've kind of rattled through the last few slides. I think in this case I was trying to obviously convey quite a lot of information to all of you. I'm quite conscious of time. So if you do have any questions, I'll give you a minute to sort of compose your thoughts or pull anything together. And in the meantime, I thought I'd just give you an update what's coming next. We're doing these every week. There's a high number of people coming every week to these, so we can continue to do them. As you can see, we're trying to bake in your own kind of questions and your own sort of things you're looking at. So please just let us know if there's anything you'd like us to cover in the data that we've got. We're designing it around the sort of questions and problems that different companies are having. As a business, we're sort of split into two. So we've got our research team and then we've got our product development and innovation team as well. So we will be running a webinar on the 14th of July where we're covering some of the kind of more impressive innovations that have occurred over the pandemic, with the hope of interviewing different organizations about how they solve the problems. We're going to be talking about different case studies of what companies have done and give you oversight in terms of if you are working in an organization that wants to be able to move quicker and faster, well, what are the things you need to do? What kind of things could you be looking at? So I'll be running that with our head of technology. So we'll be running it more on a kind of a conversational type approach addressing those sort of concerns. So if you are interested in attending, then please do let me know, and I'll send you around an invite. But I'm really sorry, we're sort of running out of time for questions. I do apologise. So if you have any, then please do let me know. There's a couple that have just come in. If it's all right, I'll reply to you via email after the session. But thank you very much for attending. I hope that was useful, and I will see you next Thursday at 11 o'clock.